Here's what's coming up in episode 218, Heather Greene.
So the witch has been with humanity since the beginning. And it only has been recently in the past, 50, 60 years that the word's been reclaimed as a practice, as a moniker of power associated, as you see in my book, often with women's power. So it's changed, but she's been with us since the beginning.
Holy wow, this is an awesome movie. I expected to roll my eyes and I was like, this is kind of cool. Where was I?
Yeah, I don't know where you were, because that was a big watershed moment. It's a watershed film for witch films, just generally. But it was a pretty big watershed film for teenagers at the time. So you definitely missed that in 96.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Heather Greene is a freelance writer, journalist, and editor. She received a BA in film at Wesleyan University and an MA in film studies from Emory University. She also studied film and theater at Cornell University and the University of Paris. Heather has written for Religion News Service, Turner Classic Movies, The Wild Hunt, Circle Magazine, Pathos.com, and other outlets. She is a member of Circle Sanctuary, Covenant of the Goddess, and the Religion Newswriters Association. You can find more about Heather at heathergreene.net, and that's green with an E at the end, by the way, heathergreene.net. Today, we're going to talk to Heather about her exciting new book, which I just finished recently, Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, a critical history of witches in American film and television. And I want to read the description to you. No industry has been as influential at shaping the popular notion of what it means to be a witch quite as much as Hollywood. This book traces the fascinating history of witchcraft and witches in American film and television. From Joan the Woman and The Wizard of Oz to Carrie and Charmed, journalist and film scholar Heather Greene explores how these films profoundly influenced the public image of the witch and how they reflect the negotiation of a woman's power within patriarchal society. Lights, Camera, Witchcraft uncovers fascinating insights into the intersection of entertainment, critical theory, gender studies, and religion. Greene also demonstrates how real-life witches and famous occultists influenced Hollywood productions from the silent era to today. After reading this exceptional work, you'll see Hollywood witchery in a whole new light. All right, witches, let's pour the tea. Heather Greene, it is so awesome to have you here in the Parlor on the Big Seance podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
First off, I have to tell you that I did homework as I progressed through this book. And I watched many of the films that I missed. Like there were films I'm like, how did I miss that? That is totally like my generation. But even, back to silent films, I was checking stuff out. And it took me down some rabbit holes that may end up even being in future episodes of the podcast. So I love this book and people should definitely check it out.
Thank you. Yeah, it took me down rabbit holes, to be honest. There's so much to it. There's so many threads. There's so many stories, tidbits, theory, all kinds of stuff. So it was a ton of work to write, but it was a ton of fun.
You even cover television. And when you go back to, I mean, that was the other thing I was going to say to kick this thing off, was that my mind was blown by the sheer number of films and television programs with witch characters, going back to so many films, and so many of the stories and concepts get repeated over and over throughout the decades. Yet I missed so many of them since I've been alive. You know, so the witch in films has really been with us this whole time. Where did she come from, and why are we so fascinated with her?
You're exactly right. She has been with us since the beginning. Hollywood did not invent her, although they did recreate and add and change up a little bit. And that's what my book explores. But she came from, well, as a loaded question, honestly. I mean,
Sure.
The witch has been with us since recorded history. If you're to speak more generally, and, you know, defining what a witch is, that gets down into one of those wonderful rabbit holes. Generally speaking, the witch historically has been usually a woman, although not always, that sits in the liminal space or outside of society, or does something that offends society. So it wasn't a religious term or a practice like we see today in modern time. The witch is something that's been with us as a derogatory term for the most part, or a label for people that you don't like. And that is still the case today in much of the world, even though we do have modern witches practicing in the United States. So the witch has been with humanity since the beginning. And it only has been recently in the past, 50, 60 years that the word's been reclaimed as a practice, as a moniker of power, associated, as you see in my book, often with women's power. So it's changed, but she's been with us since the beginning.
Let's see. Last night I watched, and I had no idea that it was 3 parts, which makes sense for 3 sovereigns for Sarah. But I watched all 3 PBS 3 late last night and loved it. And that is, you know, along the lines of Salem and all of that. You know, a lot of the films you don't have anymore. They have, you know, disappeared or burned or whatever. But I watched Rose O' Salem Town, and I watched The Cavalier's Dream, and I actually watched The Witch from 2015 that I can't believe I missed. I don't know where I was for that, but that was a really, really awesome movie. Of course, I rewatched Hocus Pocus for the 800,000th time. That's not going to surprise anybody listening to this. I have no clue where I was for The Craft. I was in high school for The Craft. And so I watched it 2 nights ago, and I was like, holy wow, this is an awesome movie. I expected to roll my eyes, and I was like, this is kind of cool. Where was I?
Yeah, I don't know where you were, because that was a big watershed moment. It's a watershed film for witch films just generally, but it was a pretty big watershed film for teenagers at the time. So you definitely missed that in 96. But I'm very impressed to hear you saying that you are watching the silent ones, because normally people don't, you know, they go, oh, there's a silent film, and they don't try to see the ones that are actually still around. And so that's pretty impressive. I like to hear that.
One of the last ones I checked out that I didn't mention because I kind of had to skim through it, because it's difficult when you're watching a silent film and the context isn't as easily there. We're used to sound and all these other elements to help us. But the Fanchon, the cricket
Fanchon.
From 1915. Oh, Fanchon.
Yes.
And it was interesting, but I mean, it's like watching a movie on mute, you know, trying to follow along. But yeah, I tried.
I always advise that when you read the book, you actually watch the movies as you go along, because it makes it way more fun and way more pertinent to everything. And you get to see it. Yeah. It slows the book down and makes it like more fun. So yeah, I always advise people watch the movies as you go along. Don't wait till the end. Well,
that makes sense, because after I watched some of the films, I was like, oh man, well, now I got to go back and read that section again, because now it's going to make sense.
Exactly. Read, watch, read either, but don't just read the books through from cover to cover. Watch the movies as you go along. Every single chapter has a list of the movies that I reviewed, and you can go watch them all. So it's a lot of years of watching, but a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love the list, and also just a really awesome bibliography too.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
One of the other things that I had no clue about, and I don't know if it's just me or if other Gen X and millennials knew that there was a Sabrina the Teenage Witch in the 60s, the original. I had no idea about that either.
Sabrina is one of my favorite witch characters, and people don't realize or talk enough about how important she is in our culture and also to the development or the representation of teenage girls. But she's long lived. I mean, not a lot of witch characters, not a lot of characters, but not a lot of witch characters specifically have lasted that long and had so many incarnations. She's absolutely fascinating. I have some of the original comic books I bought for it just to read the original ones, which were before my time. She was in the 60s, the 70s, and then disappeared for a while, then came back in the 90s, and then came back in the 2000s, and then eventually the latest one, which is the horror incarnation of her, which was a fabulous show. Excellent. I thought so anyway.
Do all of the girls that loved Sabrina during the 90s, is it common knowledge that that wasn't the original Sabrina the Teenage Witch?
You know, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I didn't do a survey to find out. I would guess that it probably wasn't well known by the younger generations, but the people that were young children in the 70s would have seen the cartoons because she was on, was it Saturday morning cartoons? They would have seen her with the Groovy Ghoulies. They would have seen her with the Archie series. So they would have known.
So probably parents of this generation would have known.
And they definitely would, because the first ones were in the 60s during the comic book heyday. So they would have known. So I'm not sure. But the 90s Sabrina was the one that hit the biggest.
Yeah.
And was the most popular in the end, if we were to look at numbers. That's my guess.
Yeah, I remember my sister and I, we didn't have cable at our house, but we would go to my grandma's house after school and we would watch Sabrina and a lot of those other, Nickelodeon shows. So I do know Sabrina. I watched her.
That's great.
In your book, you have come up with some main categories or types of witches, and they break out from there. But the main categories that you list are the accused woman, which kind of makes sense to me, going back to history and Salem and all of that. There's the wild woman. There is the fantasy witch. And then there's this other category, which includes, when men come in, and then this uncomfortable topic of the other, the magical other. But I would wondered if you could please tell us just about a few of the most popular types of witches in film.
Sure. And all of these that I'm going to mention are derivatives of those three main categories, or those five main categories, if we were to include the two smaller ones. So you have one of the main ones that we first see with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and then develops further, is the vamp witch. And I talk about the vamp witch, and she appears in fantasy, which is like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Wicked Queen. They are usually represented as extremely beautiful and sexy and dangerous. They're more dangerous when you start seeing them in horror. You can see vamp witches also in comedy sometimes. Someone like I Married a Witch. Jennifer is a vamp witch. Again, you have that combination of female sexuality, beauty, and magic. So you wind up with this vamp witch. And vamp comes from a term from the 1920s films of the Marlene Dietrich type of actresses that were so beautiful and had so much power and just gave away that kind of feeling. They were called vamps. And so that is where I took the term from. That's very common. And we see that especially when we get into the horror in the 70s, 80s, and beyond. We see a lot of the vamp witch. Another really popular type of witch, which everybody loves, is what I call the witch next door. That's mostly a fantasy witch. That's Sabrina. It is Jillian from Bell Book and Candle. Of course, Samantha. These witches, and even Morticia, although she's a vamp, she kind of walks that line, because the witch next door is usually someone that is likable, or someone you might see next door, but they're not necessarily the witches that are evil that are next door. They're not dressed weird. They're not satanic practitioners. These are sort of the girl next door, the Marianne, so to speak, of witches. And you have that. And it's usually a comedy. That's another really popular one. Of course, the Teenage Witch, super popular. You got The Craft, you got Sabrina, you've got a ton of teenage witches in the early 2000s, Witches of the Caribbean, and you have them in the Blair Witch, the second one. So there's a bunch of teenage witches. Charmed, another one, even though they weren't really teenagers. Twitches, you have that. Harry Potter, of course, spurred that kind of stuff. You also, of course, have satanic witches. These are the ones that are actually practicing a satanic practice, or what's defined as a satanic practice. And they come in many flavors. Crones, old crones, in things like To Save a Child. And then another one that I love is to talk about is the clown witch. And I'm bringing that up only because you love Hocus Pocus. And those three witches are modern incarnations or 90s incarnations of clown witches. They're usually silly to some extent, not necessarily evil like a satanic witch would be. They're usually very colorful, boisterous. Their costuming is just outrageous. They have this outrageous quality. And the clown witch is one of the oldest incarnations. We see her in silent film too. They sometimes run bookstores, metaphysical bookstores. They do weird spells that sometimes don't work, that kind of thing.
And you talked about Victorian dresses is a key part of that clown witch.
Yeah, that's the kind of the sense of the outrageous.
Yeah.
So you have that to some degree in the early days, in the silent era. She was more patchwork and also had a Victorian, but it had a different flavor that it was more set in the time. The context was there.
Yeah.
Now, when you put Victorian costumes on these clown witches that are green, red, purple, it looks even more outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have great commentary. The whole first half of the book, it seems like, is, the themes of keeping women in their place. And that is often, and I'm not going to say it very beautifully at all, but that is often how the witch storyline was used, because a white man came and saved them from their witchcraft and turned them into the normal, what you would expect woman, because witchcraft was horrible. Well, I think that is fascinating, but also, in our modern times with a lot of the stuff going on in Supreme Court and all of this stuff, I think it continues. We have truly not left that, but talk to us about those themes.
Yeah, as the subtitle of my book says, it's a critical history. It's not just a history. So I'm not only just telling you this film was at this time and this film was at this time. I actually walk you through a number of different theoretical and social constructs that happen. And one of them is this one. That's the big one, actually. And often I will say that the book is as much a story of the American woman in American culture, or the woman in American culture, as it is about the witch herself in a narrative sense. So what you find is that because witchcraft has been historically something thrown at women to defame her, let's say, just generally, and what it's become linked to is women's power. And you can see that in the early films. You can see it throughout, actually, that witchcraft, it becomes an allegory for a woman's power, her innate power, not only how she acts, but also who she is, her sexuality, her roles, her agency, all the things. So you wind up with these early shows using the relationship between our society and witchcraft at the time was a woman's power, and a way Hollywood used it as a way to tell women how not to act. It was a place where women could go for fun for a little bit during a film, like I Married a Witch, where it's fun to watch her do her thing. But in the end, you can't have witchcraft in love. You can't have witchcraft in marriage. And ultimately, Hollywood's resolution for women at the time was marriage. Women want marriage. Women should be married. Women should be calm. They shouldn't be too sexy. They shouldn't be too powerful. So witchcraft was that thing that women could accidentally dive into, maybe, but in the end, they needed to retreat back to their normal place. And I get into that in different facets of the early times. Witches weren't necessarily bad in the early days, but they weren't necessarily good either. And that gets more stark in the later periods, where you start to get into horror, when you start to see its relationship to more directly to outrageous sexuality, abuse of their sexuality, or what is defined as abuse. And then eventually into the 80s, where you see witchcraft being defined as a woman who has gone too far, who is stepping way outside of the bounds, which is like Witches of Eastwick, mm-hmm. or witchcraft, where the witches are, it's not just an accidental spell or something fun anymore. These witches have gone too far. They're delving in satanic magic, etc. So you get that backlash against women. And that's why witchcraft films were very popular in the 80s. And that continues on. And it isn't until the 90s when Wicca and modern paganism started to bubble up even more in a positive way after the Satanic Panic, that you start to see Hollywood demonstrating that witchcraft isn't necessarily bad. In some cases, it's actually powerful and spiritual and helps girls. For example, The Craft or Charmed. You start to see a change in the 90s there. And that has continued on since then. And, at this point, witchcraft has been reclaimed in a sense by women as well as men and all genders, actually, to speak to that, to speak to power.
I love that you straight up just call it the girl power era of witch films. And I love that. I'll be right back with Heather Greene right after this.
You're listening to the Big Seance podcast with Patrick Keller. Be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
This episode of the Big Seance podcast is brought to you again by Jim Harold's Campfire. And if you like stories of the strange, the weird, and the unexplained, well, then you need to check it out. If you're a longtime listener, you likely know that Jim Harold was one of the inspirations for the Big Seance. The very first podcast I ever subscribed to, it was produced by Jim Harold. He's been podcasting since the early days of podcasting. In fact, I think he's the OG paranormal podcaster. And he's approaching the lucky 13th anniversary of his Campfire show. If you haven't listened yet, the concept is pretty simple. Jim just talks to regular peeps about the strange stuff that happens to them for 90 minutes every week. Ghosts, UFOs, cryptids, and head scratchers. He doesn't exaggerate or play a lot of spooky music. The stories, they just speak for themselves. Now, I just checked out the most recent episode of Jim Harold's Campfire, and I see that he's gone back to the archives all the way to 2009. And he's played his best calls about shadow people. So make sure to check that out. Now, not all the stories are horrifying. Some are heartwarming. A visit from a past loved one, or even a peaceful near-death experience. Den of Geeks said Jim Harold's Campfire is perhaps the best tool we have currently in existence to hear real-life scary stories from other human beings since the actual campfire was invented. Well, regardless of the story, they are true and fascinating, as told by ordinary people who've had extraordinary experiences. Jim supports us, so let's all tune in to Jim Harold's Campfire on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the Big Seance.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Seance podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
You mentioned, I think in the book, that Hocus Pocus was the end, that line between what came before girl power and then was Hocus Pocus kind of one of the last big films that was, the accused woman, and
The Craft was the one on the line that right between. Hocus Pocus was a little bit before that, 1993. Am I correct? I bet you did.
Yes. I guess it was the end of the Satanic Panic period, I think maybe is what you said too.
Right. Well, Hocus Pocus falls dead in the middle of the Satanic Panic, and is definitely one of those films. I mean, with the Satanic Panic was a period of time where people were worried that Satanism and witchcraft was harming children. So if you take that knowledge and then apply it to Hocus Pocus, you see how the film was successful, because it was tapping into a cultural fear that had no grounding. This was not happening, but we have a lot of films like Hocus Pocus that tapped into that. Another one would be Witches. That was, I believe, 91. Same thing. You have a bunch of witches who are harming children. So you see that repeated over and over. To Save a Child. What's the one? The Witching of Ben. I can't remember the title of it. There was a lot of made-for-TV films that really captured this.
Y'all, there's a lot of films in this book. There's lists and lists.
But it's amazing to come out of that period of time, which you're talking about, whether it was, Hocus Pocus or the witches, or you go into horror, true horror, and you'd say Witchcraft or Witches of Eastwick or The Warlock, you have any of those films. And then you hit The Craft, and it's like a complete turnaround where witchcraft now is something that feeds into girl power, a movement that had been growing since the early 90s, but really hit its stride in the late 90s when you have Charmed and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a girl could do anything at this point. We've made it now.
I want to talk about this production code that really, really impacted, probably negatively, I would assume, the story of the witch in films.
Yeah, the production code was removed in 1968. So everything prior to, or actually I shouldn't say everything, from 1934, 34 to 1968 was the production code period. Largely when you think of golden era Hollywood films and all of the regulations and what you see there culturally presented was because of the production code. It regulated everything from dress, behavior, dancing, what could be said, curse words, things about marriage. It was written by a Catholic layman and a Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest. So it was very heavily influenced by religious belief, although not explicitly stated, but that's who wrote it. And it was instituted because Hollywood at the time in the 1920s had really gotten into the jazz era age. And there was a lot of fun stuff going around that a lot of people were scared about. And they also didn't like the material that was coming out on film. They felt it was a little bit too risque. So the government was going to, there was a risk the government was going to start regulating films. And this was the 20s. So the film industry said, no, we'll do it ourselves. And that's why they did this, to prevent the government from interfering. That's the quick and dirty version of the story. So everything, what it did for The Witch, what the production code did for The Witch, and a lot of people don't understand that Hollywood was censored, highly censored.
Yeah.
And that's why when we look back at 1950s films and 1940s films, I like to say to people, that was not reality. That was not America. That was a highly censored version that's being presented and represented.
Because they took all the options away. They took all the fun out.
They took all the fun out. They took the ability to express freely out. Every single film went through the production code and they would say, take this curse word out. Take this, we don't like the way this is presented. You can't show marriage has got to be positive. Marriage is between a man and a woman. All the things were in there. It was very highly regulated. Religion had to be treated. People of, people that were not white were marked off and said, oh, is there someone? Because there were some theaters that wouldn't present films that had anyone but white people. I'm not kidding. This was very, very seriously censored. What it did for The Witch is kept her out of horror. There are very few horror films with a witch in it prior to 1968. Couple. Mostly B or indie films. Roger Corman, one of my favorites, The Naked Witch, which is absolutely what the director called schlock. It's terrible, but it's one of those code era witch horror films. But most mainstream films did not have a witch. And if it did, it was something like The Wizard of Oz or Bell Book and Candle. It had to fit in, and it was mostly fantasy, witches next door. Women who had witchcraft would then get rid of their witchcraft,
We could save them.
Save them. It was something silly. And they argued that people did not believe that witchcraft really existed. So, why bother making these horror films? So when 1968 came, and this goes back to your question, when they dropped the code, I like to say all hell broke loose, because all of a sudden, almost all the movies in the 1970s were horror films. And they are fun to watch, I have to say.
You said Rosemary's Baby is kind of the first to, the code wasn't done yet, but they ignored the code basically. And boy, that's, what a movie to pop out of the cake with no production code.
Oh yeah. And that really it was successful immediately, especially with all of the lore that centered around it, and people dying and, being haunted or not haunted, but, possessed or something, all of that stuff. And it's actually one of the best to date witch films that you could watch. And it launched a whole slew of similar films. It was referenced in films within a year or two. That's how powerful that film was overall. But yes, that's the marker. No more production code. Rosemary's Baby.
Surprise! It's like a coming out party.
It's true.
Do you know what the first film was to consult real life practicing witches?
I I'm going to guess it's necromancy. 1972, Raymond Buckland was a consultant on that. He is not credited, but he did, according to my sources and according to some other documents that I have, consult. And there might have been a few others. It's hard to find because during the early 70s, there were a lot of, there was a mixing of the modern pagan community, which was first coming out in Hollywood. You know, you had also Anton LaVey and Satanism and stuff working in the Hollywood worlds too, and people were getting into that. So, and New Age, you might have had others then that just weren't credited, but I know he did, and that was 1972. Whether there was any before, I have no idea. You don't really see it again. You don't hear about it again until The Craft, which was the big one because that was very open. They did that on purpose, and they were very vocal about that. And the priestess, the Wiccan priestess, she did interviews. So you had it there. And then it continued over time. I will say, though, in the 1980s, there was a TV show called Tucker's Witch, which was, and why is his name escaping me at this moment? I'll think of it in a second. He's a witch that worked in the Hollywood. He was a screenwriter, and he actually, he didn't consult, but he actually created Tucker's Witch. And his book, Mastering Witchcraft, was used regularly in the 70s horror films. So that could also be conceivably the mixing. The mixing began in the 70s. The first consultation, I think, was Raymond Buckland.
How has Hollywood impacted people getting into real life, you know, being a witch and Wicca and witchcraft? Do you think we would have modern witchcraft without Hollywood?
Oh,
Or would it still be just like the lore of like the old woman in the woods or whatever?
No, we would obviously have modern witchcraft if it wasn't for Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood's just reflecting what we're doing, really. They're not making this stuff up. I mean, they give us green skin, but they didn't make the witch up herself, nor did they make up a lot of the practices and traditions that are now part of modern witchcraft. They didn't make up tarot cards or circle practices and raising energy. None of that came from Hollywood. What Hollywood's doing from a negative perspective, of course, the perpetuation of negative stereotypes when it comes to witchcraft. I don't think there's any way of getting around that because Hollywood essentially didn't create that negative stereotype. So they're just using it from, like you said, the old witch in the woods and all this stuff. However, they are also have been over the past, since The Craft really, maybe a little before, demonstrating the ways witchcraft is practiced now in positive ways. So that's the one big thing that Hollywood is doing. Although maybe it's not meeting people's expectations, the fact that it's doing that, it's helping promote and also demonstrate that Wicca and Druidry and other forms of modern paganism and magical practice exist and are positive as well. It's not just green skin and the old witch in the woods. It's also that beautiful scene in The Craft, for example, when they do the butterflies, when they're in the circle, that's very reminiscent of modern practice. So you're seeing that. And The Craft was actually a gateway for a lot of teens to start exploring it, to find their power that way. And that's continued. And I think that's continued again in the last 10 years. It's come up. We've seen a lot of this happening again.
One of the homework items that I worked on was watching the episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street where Margaret Hamilton appeared. And I remember seeing the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood episode. It was a long time ago, but I rewatched that. And I hadn't seen the Sesame Street one because I think they've pulled it really. And I'm not sure if anybody ever saw it. But why was there so much controversy? And this shocks me in the 70s. In the 70s, why was there so much controversy with Margaret Hamilton coming back to kind of, you know, revisit her character from The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, she was real popular during the 70s, especially with the upswing in witch content on television. And even in film, she started to appear more and more. The Wizard of Oz had become a classic by this point. So there was controversy because when she appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in the 70s, it was the same year, she came on as herself. And she comes on and walks on and she looks like herself. She's older at this point and says, oh, the witch is not real. It's just a costume. And Mr. Rogers, I believe, puts the hat on, if I remember correctly. And they show this a costume. And they really talk about how this is just all imaginary, that witchcraft and witches aren't real. Now, that upset some modern witches, including Laurie Cabot, who's from, the famed Salem witch. Many people know her. But that was a small protest. The bigger protest was Sesame Street, because Sesame Street brought her on as the character. So she comes on as this wicked witch of the West and loses her broom and then proceeds to terrorize Sesame Street. And apparently there was just a flood of emails, and I have some of them. I worked with the Children's Television Network. They were really gracious in helping me see this, that there was such an outpouring of, that's the wrong word, not an outpouring of support. There was such
surge.
There was such a surge of disappointment and a flood of letters from parents who said their kids were just terrified and they couldn't watch it. And why would you put this on television, etc. So the person in charge at the time, and I forget her name, decided that the episode would be put in the vault and never to be seen again. In fact, it resurfaced about a month ago. So you can now see it on YouTube. It's the first time it's been seen for decades, and that's the Sesame Street one. But what I talk about in the book, and hopefully you remember, is that in the 80s, there was a different reaction because Sesame Street didn't appear in the 80s, the Sesame Street, but the Mr. Rogers kept replaying his. So when you enter into the Satanic Panic of the 80s, where people are now terrified of witchcraft and Satanism and ritual abuse, you now get a flood of the same type of emails going to Mr. Rogers, which did not happen in the 70s. It only happened in the 80s. And those emails were referencing the Satanic Panic. They actually say, why are you airing this? Don't you know that so many kids are being abused by witchcraft and Satanism, et cetera. So the backlash in the 70s was just because kids were scared. No mention of no religious content, no mention of anything. 80s, you get the quotes from the Bible, you get the religious content, it's a different reaction.
That is so fascinating. Who is your favorite witch character? I mean, is that a difficult question?
It is a difficult question, but I always say the Wicked Witch of the West, since we're on her. I was always a big fan of Wizard of Oz. I watched it every year when it came around Halloween on television. I actually have a VHS tape. I love to tell people about my tape. I have a VHS tape that my dad recorded off television, complete with the commercials. And I just love to watch that with the commercials. It just brings me back. I love Golden Era Hollywood. I love just film in general. So that just wraps it up all in one. You got witches, you got old Hollywood, you got classic actors. So I love it. And it's a musical. It's never a bad thing in my book. So the Wicked Witch would be my favorite. And I actually talk about that right at the beginning of the book. I just say why right away.
So you kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning. We've talked about men and where they show up in witchcraft. One of my favorite things to watch around Halloween every year is and I'm sure you know it, one of the Halloween episodes of Roseanne, where DJ, the little boy character, wants to be a witch for Halloween. And, they're like, oh, but boys aren't witches and all of that stuff. But he really wants to be a witch. And then, the dad says, oh, but why don't you be a warlock? Because, those are male witches. And he's like, but I want a broom. And he's like, well, warlocks don't have brooms. And he's like, well, then I want to be a witch. And so eventually it plays through this whole gender thing. And eventually they just kind of give up and say, okay, fine, you can be a witch. And growing up, I remember thinking, but the witch is so cool. Why can't I be a witch? I remember my mom coming to Halloween parties at our school and she was always a witch. And I remember thinking her costume was so cool. And I'm like, I was always dressed up as a clown or like a vampire or something. I'm like, but what if I want to be a witch? And that hat, come on.
Seriously.
I love that in that same Roseanne episode, Dan, the dad, says, but witches are girls. And And Roseanne says, "This is the 90s, Dan. Witches are women."
That's fantastic.
I know too many lines from Roseanne. I can quote them all the time. That's pretty embarrassing. So tell us about some of, where do the male witches come into play, or some of those others?
Well, the male witches, you can count them probably very easily. There's not a whole lot of them, especially in the golden era, because just like you said, what the Roseanne episode points to is that there was this is societal understanding that a witch is a woman. And so you have very few. You actually have pre-1968. So you have the Bell Book and Candle. You have the dad in I Married a Witch. You have one accused witch in a silent film that's a man. And then in the 60s, you get a couple of witches that are satanic practice, usually ceremonial magicians. So I talk about this in the book, that the different types that there are. There are male witches. They're usually comical because the joke is man can't be a witch. So they kind of take that joke on. And then you have others that are defined as ceremonial magicians. Okay, so they're more like the ones that are practicing some kind of ritualistic magic, which you see in like House of Black Death and in necromancy and stuff. And you get more of them into the 70s. You also get the fantasy magicians, which would be like Jack the Giant Killer. You have one there. You have Merlins. You have those, which are not really witches. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Now, warlock, the term, people think it's used more often than it's not. It's not used all that much, but that would be the way to, for lack of a better way, to make it more masculine.
Yeah.
Is I think the only reason that term is used, because you can't call them a witch because witches are girls. Same thing as the Roseanne said. But you see that a little bit, but typically they're just the same. They're usually the horror version of the male witch, the horror version of what we see in I Married a Witch or whatever. So you have that warlock. One of the most interesting male witches, and I don't know if you saw this movie or not, The Covenant from 2009.
No, but you know what? If I hadn't run out of time, Bell Book and Candle and The Covenant were going to be the next two that I watched.
Yeah, The Covenant's very interesting because it gets to this gender play issue that we're talking about. But you also have a lot of the male witches are defined as Satan himself, which is sort of more like what you see in the Witches of Eastwick. But The Covenant's interesting because what they did was they tried to take the story that you saw like in The Craft, teen female witches, teen girls that want to be witches or are witches, like in Charm, for example, naturally. They take that kind of same exact story and try to transfer it to 4 boys, teenage boys. And then it's interesting to watch. Does it work for you? Because it's a unique story. Usually male witches are trying to conquer over a society, over a community. They want to be the ultimate hero, like Harry Potter. They're on the hero's tale, the hero's journey. It's a very much a male coming of age story. Whereas the witch's story, teen girl story, is a woman's coming of age story, dealing with the coming of puberty and getting her period. A lot of these are wrapped into that. So you have that allegory going on. Does that work for 4 boys? I called it, I think in my book, I said The Covenant was like a boy band or something like that, right?
I was just going to say that. I said, somebody called it a boy band flick.
It was. You have to, I love watching good and bad movies. And this is one, it's so unusual. I'm not sure it worked, but they tried. They tried.
Okay, so last question. And I think this is probably a big question. So kind of like we were talking before, we really do I really feel like we live in unsettling times right now. And, recently our incredibly conservative Supreme Court here in the US has basically given the middle finger to women, taking away human rights, which could spiral into other groups losing rights as well. And we've seen major world events impact the witch in films. And so considering recent events, I wonder where you think her story goes in the future.
I get asked this question a lot, and my answer is always the same, that my crystal ball is at the shop, so I'm not sure. But it's hard to say because, as I say in my book, is that the witch is always going to be the liminal figure that's pushing the boundaries. She's forever going to be an activist, so to speak. She's always going to be someone who's not at the center of society. So she's going to push the boundaries. And right now, in the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of changes to who she is and what she practices. Magic is no longer Wicca. Magic is no longer just Wicca. Magic is no longer the fantasy magic we see in Snow White and in Disney films or Wizard of Oz. They're starting to show us there are other forms of magical practice in other communities, folk magics, voodoo in positive ways. We've also seen more progressive representations of gender and sexuality as witches. Witches are becoming everyone, which I think speaks to your point. And magical practice is becoming a power from any community, not just, for example, middle-class white girls like it was in the 90s power movement. So you're starting to see an opening up. And I think that's paralleling what you're talking about, paralleling this difficult period of time we're in, where we're seeing a lot of progressive movements stepping forward into light, pushing boundaries. So the witch is always there at the forefront of that. She's always going to be representing the oppressed and their search for power. And now we see it's not just women, or it's not just white women, of European origin. She's always going to be represented in some way that which harkens back to her historical meaning that I spoke about earlier. So where is she going to go from here really depends on what boundaries are pushed. She's always going to be, her power is always the allegory for the power of the oppressed, the internal power of the oppressed.
I have loved having you so much and love talking about this. I love all my witch friends. I hope I didn't sound too ignorant. Sometimes I do when I, talk about the actual modern witchcraft. But I want to thank you, and I want to give you the opportunity to give us any final thoughts and tell us where we can find you these days and if there's anything coming up. And, you totally rock.
Well, thank you very much. You can find me at my website, heathergreene.net. And there is where I do have most of my work in terms of podcasts and my writings and where I am, and all my socials are there. So you can find me there. And you also, which I'm working on, and hopefully if you give me a few more days, I will hopefully have all my articles up, because I'm also a journalist and I focus on paganism and witchcraft in religion as a religion journalist too. I wrote an article right after the SCOTUS decision, or it was right before, I think we published it, talking about women's power and hearkening back to days before abortion was legal and what was being done magically or spiritually in herbal centers on how to handle this. So I submitted the article, and the editor who wrote the headline did a fantastic job saying, how do you make 1,000 witches with one SCOTUS decision?
Right.
That's a fantastic headline. And that speaks again to the point you made earlier about what's going to happen. You got a lot of women out there who might just start practicing witchcraft.
Bring it on is what I'm saying. Bring it. Bring it, and I might join you.
Please. Please do.
Heather Greene, you rock.
Thank you very much. I loved being here.
Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/Parlor guests, are Allie of Hocus Pocus Collector, Miranda from SpookyLittleHalloween.com, Chelsea from Cheers with Chelsea, Linda from ShimmeringMoons.com, Anne Rekovich from OzParatech.com, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Mitchell Coombs from MitchellCoombs.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Amy Park Gedicke of AmyParkG.com, Lena and John of Carbon Lilies, Amy Taylor, Danielle Hembury, Alicia Ferguson, Morgan O'Hearn, Sarita Cockerham, Christine Rath-Selhe, Mindy Kentop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Diane Rax, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Jim Budd, David Rubenstein, and Norman and Linda Keller. That sound you just heard was the above and beyond there's not even a category for your level of support fireworks display. Because I have 5 awesome listeners who support this show at the $10 level. Peggy Hagan, Glenna Becker, Steve Skinner, Kevin Gilbert, and James Wilfong. So thank you, Peggy, Glenna, Steve, Kevin, and James. And thank you, Paranerds. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of Paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.